Hello and welcome to the Tender Rejection Index video. In this video, we're going to be explaining what the Tender Rejection Index is, the different variations of the TRI, and also what they mean and how they interact with the rest of the market and how to use it. So let's get started with the definition of a Tender Rejection Index. So the Tender Rejection Index, what it's saying is the carriers are turning down the shippers' loads that they're sending over. So if a shipper sends over 4 loads and the carrier rejects 2 of them in a particular market, that's a 50% tender rejection rate. And that's what the Tender Rejection Index is telling you. How often or with what frequency is the shipper sending over loads and the carriers are rejecting them. And it's not just one carrier or one shipper, it's a big pile of them. So, and they're organized into outbound and inbound on the primary levels. And they're also organized by the city market regions. So you'll have various market regions throughout the country. You'll put in OTRI, for instance, for the Outbound Tender Rejection Index, and then .ATL for Atlanta. There are lists available on the website and then a knowledge center that will let you know what the names of the cities are that are available, and also the tickers and how to use them. You can also type them up here in this area right here and say you wanted to know Atlanta. So you would just start typing Atlanta, and right there you can see that all of the Atlanta market tickers are available. And we're just going to be covering the ones that have TRI in them in this video. So I'm going to stick to that. So without further ado, Outbound Tender Rejection Index.USA is what I have pulled up right here. And what this is telling us is, if you can follow the trends right here, there's been a movement of rejection indices. So back here in the winter, we had an elevated period of tender rejections. Now, one of the reasons for that is that most of the carriers were operating off of year-old contracts. I don't know if many of you know this, but in 2016, I'm sure some of you do, there were lots of, the market was just not great for trucking. The economy didn't really go into a recession, but transportation really slowed down. In middle of 2017, things picked back up rapidly. The market escalated, fuel prices went up very quickly. The overall market was it blew apart. So in January, February, March of 2018, all these contracts that were operating off 2016 assumptions had become grossly underpriced and out of date. So carriers essentially were playing the spot market out of contract because rates had increased several percentage points above what the contract were. Many of the markets were seeing almost dollar per mile rate increases, for instance, over last year's rates. So they couldn't afford not to play the spot market. So at the end of the year, carriers went to shippers, said, hey guys, you guys are going to get a rate increase, but we're going to give you guys a few months to get your stuff together, and we're going to effectively let you guys have an implementation date of sometime in the spring. They start implementing the contract rates, the rates fall. Going after this major implementation, freight probably slacked off a little bit too, but it was probably more driven by just rates. And so the tender rejections come down just under 20% here, but now you see that tender rejections have increased at the time of this video. So they're still climbing up pretty high. We're in late June. This time of year is pretty standard for elevated activity and tender rejections as capacity constricts quite a bit. Outbound tender rejection is probably the easiest thing for many people to understand. So I'm going to get a little bit more granular here and dive into specific markets. So once you've figured out that, hey, I've got a lot of spot market or a lot of tender rejections in the overall country, you want to find out where those are. So there's generally, 4 or 5 really big markets in the country for truckload volume, and that's Los Angeles, Atlanta, Dallas, Chicago. You could say that Philadelphia has an impact, and Seattle to a point, but those are a little different markets. So I would stick to the Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Dallas to keep the middle of the country and southern tier kind of in play. The mountains kind of disrupt that flow from Chicago to Seattle. Not a lot of freight coming out of Seattle, at least it's seasonal. So there's a lot of spikes in there. But right now I'm in the Los Angeles Outbound Tender Rejection Index. So I put in otry.lax and pulled this up. So again, what this is telling you is LA actually was cooling off during this period where the rest of the country was having elevated rejections. They were in the mid 20%, and LA's sitting down here, going down as low in the single digits percentages. So that's an indication that carriers were very willing to accept their contracted rates out of the LA market in the early part of the year. And they continued to accept these loads all the way into May. But then sometime in mid-May, here comes their elevated tender rejections. They shot up really fast and quite a bit. That in itself is a huge indication that the market has changed, especially in that market. They came back down a little bit and then are still on the rise into late June. Again, a good example of, if I'm a broker, I'm going to check on the rates coming out of LA right now into various markets. I'm going to make sure that I'm getting enough pricing on there to make sure that I'm not going to be holding the bill if I'm trying to cover a load and I commit to a rate with a shipper. And also, the carriers could easily get in here and use this for just seeing what the rest of the market is about right now. One of the things that I used to work at a carrier, and one of the things that we lacked was information about the general market. This tender rejection index gives you a load of information about what's happening in the rest of the market, and not just in my own world of my company. I'm not looking at year-over-year volumes. I'm looking at real market data. Now, this is near time right now. So this is going to be previous days tender rejections, but it is very close to being real time. So it's very useful in that regard, giving you another look at why you're seeing patterns in your own business the way you are. From a shipping perspective, I think it's pretty clear cut. If you think that you are going to have trouble covering loads and you're seeing that your particular area, such as if you're shipping out of LA, has elevated activity in it, you want to get some validation for that. Maybe you need to make some production decisions based on your transportation costs. Maybe hold something back, wait a little bit, or get something out now because it needs to go. You know that the carriers are probably going to start rejecting your loads more frequency. You can make plans and arrangements to get around that. So the tender rejection index outbound is very useful for all of those things. Now, one of the things that isn't as clear cut to a lot of people, and that is the inbound version of this. So I'm going to go through that a little bit, just to kind of give a point of reference, because inbound is a little bit more difficult to wrap your head around. So inbound is the same data that the outbound is. It's just organized on the destination and not the origin. So the origin is pretty easy to conceptualize. You're thinking about shippers. You're thinking about commodity flows. You're thinking about, it's really easy to understand, like, well, there's just no capacity in that area. When somebody's turning down a load in the origin side, it means that, that one area has something going on in it. Now, the inbound number actually tells you the carrier's general feeling or sentiment about the area that it's going into. So what that means is they may not be expecting to get good loads or freight moving out of there. The traditional backhaul scenario where you go into an area and you know you're not going to come out of it, or maybe there's weather happening, congestion. You don't want to go to New York, for instance, because of the traffic and whatnot. So the inbound is a good indicator of what carriers' general perceptions of the area. Now, when inbound rejections go down into areas such as Seattle that are traditional backhauls, or maybe there's something else going on there, it's obviously not limited to one explanation, but you get this data and you pair it with your own, and you can really figure out pretty quickly what's happening in any inbound market. So right now we're seeing the LA market is starting to see elevated inbound rejections, which is interesting because the outbound rejections were also going up. Normally when you see inbound rejections go above the outbound rejection mark, it means that you have an imbalance in that area and it becomes somewhat of a backhaul lane. So when people are turning down loads with more frequency than they are coming out, there is a spread there. And Seattle would be a good example to show you exactly what I mean. So Seattle O-Tri is going to have a very low turn down number. So the Seattle market has a 5.5% turn down ratio. That means that the carriers that are in that market, they're not turning down loads coming out because they're desperate to get out of the market in general. They have capacity and they're ready to get out. They'll take whatever they can get on the contract side. So on the inbound side, we get a completely different story. They are turning down the loads at a 24% rate right now. It's coming down a little bit, but it's still quite high in relation to the outbound situation. This is the traditional backhaul scenario. So that's a good indication. So when you have a market like LA, that's kind of a heavy freight area, and those two switch and change back and forth, that is a good signal that you have opportunity, and it might require more digging into. All right, so I'm going to move on to the other versions or organizational levels of the tender rejection index. So next up we have the equipment type indices, and that is divided into van, flatbed, and reefer. So I'm going to start with the van, and it's gonna be pretty close to the national, because the majority of the freight moving is on the dry van side. So it's gonna look very close and similar to the standard O-Tri, but it is going to allow you to separate your tender rejection indices into equipment types, and the R-Tri, or the reefer tender rejection index, is going to give you the temperature controlled tender rejections. Now keep in mind, all of these organizational levels they're the same data, they're just sliced differently. So the O-Tri has all the R-Tri, V-Tri, and F-Tri in it. It's just not sliced in that manner. So if you have the R-Tri, F-Tri, and V-Tri all together, that equals the O-Tri in total. So this is a good way to kind of see like exactly what's happening on the reefer market. So when produce or other items such as alcohol and other things that need temperature control are moving through the system, you can get a good idea of what's happening. And of course, June, a warmer month, we see the reefer tender rejection indices moving up. So again, not that shocking, but it's a good thing to have in terms of completing your analysis or your story of what's happening in the overall market. And I will go ahead and show you the flatbed tender rejection index, just to give you guys a sample of what the flatbed tender rejection index looks like right now. So they're right about 18%, so not terribly high, but anyway, those are the equipment type TRI organizational levels. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the length of haul. And what these are, again, just like the equipment TRIs, these are the ones that are going to be organized in terms of miles traveled. The first one that I pulled up here, the local tender rejection index, is the city tri, and it is comprised of loads that have moved less than 100 miles. So your local drivers moving loads down the street. Chicago to Milwaukee, for instance, is less than 100 miles, city to city. Those type of moves, and their tender rejections relatively low because they're, you could probably do several of these in a day, or maybe they're bridging the gap between two cities that you need to get to, such as maybe you're going from Milwaukee to Chicago, and that's how you're going to get your load down to Dallas to get more miles if you're a carrier and whatnot. Some of these, I'll go ahead and move on. I'll cycle through the entire list here. So the STRI is the next level, and that is going to be 101 to 250 mile movements. So a little bit less than local. They're going to be more regional moves. It's going to be more along the lines of Chicago to St. Louis, for instance, and that's going to get you a little bit further out, less than a day's travel. Again, it might be a little bit more palatable to take a load that's a little shorter to get you to another area so you have enough time to get to the next one. But again, these are your regional moves, so they're probably bridging the gap, or maybe you just need to take what you can get at that point. These are all things that you're going to have to use to evaluate the broader market. The next one up is the M-Tri, and again, that's going to be the mid-haul tender rejection index, and that's going to be anything from 250 to about 450 miles. So right about the things that are going to take less than a day to travel. Again, a good indication if people are turning down these loads, the capacity probably is getting tight. The next one up will be the tweener tri, or the TTRI, and that is the 451 mile to about 800 mile loads. These are the ones that are going to take you anywhere from a day to a day and a half to travel. Again, longer haul, better miles, but again, it's kind of that awkward mileage. Once you get into that 800 or 700, 800 mile range, you could have been driving a lot more. And then last but not least, literally, is the L-Tri, or the long haul tender rejection index. And this is going to be anything over 800 miles. Again, a good indication of what's going on in the broader market about what carrier sentiment is in relation to the mileage bands. So again, that is the entire list of the tender rejection indices at this point. There will be more to come, and we will make other videos on those, but that is all we have for this one today. Again, tender rejection indices, they are indications of carrier sentiment in the market. If they're turning down loads more frequently, the capacity is probably not there, or they're getting a better deal somewhere else. And therefore, you'll see spot market activity right behind it.